So I'm sitting here with Professor Uoltъr Fайt here in Denmark. Thank you for coming to Denmark and wanting to do this interview. I've been watching some of your stuff, and you've been making some extensive stuff on the Roman Catholic Church and about the Jesuits. And you, as being a Christian, I would love to hear your view on who are the Jesuits and what are the Roman Catholic Church. I remember, for instance, in your Total Onslaught, The Secret Behind Secret Societies, which is a video that I would hope people would see after watching this interview, that you quote Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict, for saying that the Roman Catholic Church view themselves as the mother and not the sister of all churches, but the mother of all churches. So can you elaborate on that?
Well, the Roman Catholic system has a very long history. And Paul, when he was speaking to the early Christians, warned of a great apostasy that would arise. And this apostasy would arise when a certain power was taken out of the way. Now, the early church fathers interpreted that power as being pagan Rome, that when pagan Rome was removed as a political power, then this Antichrist system would arise. And the reformers later picked up on these explanations, and then together with Daniel chapter 7, they interpreted the symbology there as representing the Roman Catholic Church. And all the reformers were united when it came to this prophecy exposition. Even in pre-Reformation times, there were many that arose and identified the symbols of Daniel and Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, the great whore that sits in many waters. They identified it as the Roman Catholic system. And Wycliffe was one of the ones who explicitly said it. Later, Jan Hus, then the Reformers, Martin Luther, Melanchthon, and Calvin, and Hus, and Cranmer, and Latimer, and you name them, and Spurgeon. They all followed this logical exposition, Wesley. And this was the Reformed position, based on biblical prophecy. They used the day-year principle in interpreting the times that were presented. And as Spurgeon said, it fits like one of Chubb's keys, fits Chubb's locks, and refuses to fit any other system. So there are so many parameters now. I myself grew up a Roman Catholic, and when I was confronted with all these prophecies in the Bible, they certainly stunned me, and I had to come to the same conclusion based on prophecy and history. So that was the Reformed position, and of course it led to the great schism, the great separation between Protestantism and the Roman Catholic system. And the church had to counteract this, or else they would find themselves bleeding to death. They would lose their adherents, and the system would lose its power. And at that time, after the Reformation, the Order of the Jesuits was created. And the Order of the Jesuits had one explicit ideal, and that was to destroy Protestantism. And they set about it with great fervor. The system that they used initially was to put learning against learning. And the way in which they did this, they used Greek philosophy and the system of Greek philosophy, and put it into juxtaposition to the Protestant philosophy, which was based on sola scriptura, the Bible and the Bible alone. What the Bible says is the standard for what is right and what is wrong. And this system would question everything that the Bible said. And they used methodologies which were not word-based, but experiential-based. So they would use theatrics. In the beginning, they started with theatrical performances using Greek mythology. There was a system of right and wrong and a system of morality, but it wasn't based on biblical morality. It was based on humanism. And they basically started the great educational centers in the world, the universities, the schools. And eventually, if you were part of that schooling system, well, then you were part of the prestigious elite. And slowly, the ideas were eroded. They would question the basics of science. They would question all the physical parameters of the Bible. And out of this then grew the higher criticism. And later, when it was integrated with scientific ideas like Darwinism and communism, which basically is atheistic from the beginning, and communism was actually started by the Jesuits. They practiced this in their reductions in South America, the system of working. And these philosophies have their basis in Jesuitism.
Can you elaborate on how they started communism?
Well, when the great wars between Protestantism and Catholicism were taking place, they needed money. Wars run on money. And in the old system, which was not like the systems that we have today, where you have sovereign nations with standing armies, a lot of it was contract. So you would have legionnaires joining, and these had to be paid, and this cost money. And that is when the Jesuits developed their systems in South America for shipping gold from South America in their Spanish galleons to Europe in order to pay for the wars that Spain was having with the Netherlands, and finance all of the wars in Europe against the reformers. And the history is actually quite fascinating, because the Protestants would have pirate systems to try and pirate these ships and confiscate the money and turn it against them. And it was very interesting how they operated. But in order to dig up the gold, and in order to make the financial situation possible, they used the Indians basically as slave labor, and they would pay them with a pittance, and they would use the newly discovered cocaine plantations in order to enable them to climb the heights that were needed to gain access to the gold mines, etc. And there they developed this system of using the populace to work basically for the state, which was the Jesuit order, which controlled the governments that were being established. And this is how they developed it.
Do you still think that they are controlling governments?
Well, if you just do a little bit of a search and find out who are the great speechwriters of the presidents of the world, you will find many a Jesuit in those ranks. And if you look at the political intrigues in the world, there is no doubt that the Jesuits are highly influential in running the affairs of state. So to this day, that is one of their methods. So when they started introducing the system of learning against learning, they would erode the Bible. And then the system of higher criticism, which would question, let's say, the relevance of the biblical flood, and whether it was real or whether it was not. They would then pit science against it, or so-called science, and state that there couldn't have been a universal flood. Therefore, any reference to a universal flood must be based on mythology. And even down to the New Testament, where Jesus would say, and the flood came and took them all away. Well, that must be an allegory or ignorance or whatever. And so confidence in the Bible was eroded. Martin Luther took the stand that if the Bible didn't form part of an educational system, then that educational system was doomed to become corrupt. And what kind of education do we have in the world today? And who introduced it? Well, the ones who introduced it was the Jesuits. So the system that we have today is a system of learning against learning, which negates what the Bible says. The other thing that was, of course, important to them was that it could be perceived that if you were warring against the Bible, that the Bible was your enemy, but they were supposed to be representing God and Christianity. So this created a conflict. So they got round that by saying, we're not against the Bible, we're against the Protestant version of the Bible. And then you had this conflict between which version is the one that should be paramount. And that's what happened at the Council of Trent then. They condemned the Protestant version, which was based on the received text, and claimed that the Vulgate, which was not based on the received text, was the correct version of the Bible. And the Jesuits actually were instrumental in bringing out the Douay version as a counter to the Protestant version. And one text that comes to mind is where the Protestant Bible from the received text says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed, and he shall crush thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. The Douay version would feminize that and say, she shall crush your head. And therefore the Messiah would be not Jesus in that sense, but Mary would be the one to supplant him. And the Jesuit order in that way managed to undermine the authority of the Bible. That was one of the ways in which they operated. The church during the period of the Reformation, of course, had been heavily involved in suppressing it at all levels, not only the level of education, but also physically, and arresting people, handing them over to the state for execution, the Inquisition. And the Jesuits weren't actually involved directly in the Inquisition, but they became involved in Rome, where they ran the Inquisition. Other orders took care of the Inquisition elsewhere. And so there was much bloodshed, much planning, and the Jesuit general assumed a very prominent position in Rome. And as you know, he was called the Black Pope. And for reasons that are apparent, he wears black robes. And so you had the white-robed Pope and the black-robed Pope. And the Jesuit general is really the one who calls the shots behind the scene. The one is the face and represents the white side. The other one is behind the scenes, and he represents the dark side. And he really is a general, and a general is a military term. And there are other military orders, of course, in Catholicism, such as the Knights of Malta, which is a military order, the oldest military order. And there was even a conflict between those until the Jesuits eventually gained control over even the Order of Malta, and today they are basically working as a unit. So when you look at these military orders, they are literally involved in military affairs. The head of the Knights of Malta in the USA, for example, is always the Cardinal of New York, and he's also the patron of the US military. And as you know, that when you have these political gatherings, then they have the Red Affair, where the political entities from different parties come together and they're associated with this cardinal. So the church is very much involved in politics.
Yeah, and you have also, I think it was Jeremy Scahill who showed in a book that Blackwater, known later as the Academy and now XE, is also heavily involved with the Knights of Malta. They are seeing this as a holy war against Muslims.
Yes, I mean there are many orders that are involved in government activities. You have the Knights of Columbus. You have the orders that we've already spoken about, the Jesuits, which of course run many major universities in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Georgetown University being one of them. There are many that run under the auspices of the church, but really behind the scenes are also controlled by the Jesuit order. And they set the tone for the thinking. And many presidents and children of presidents are educated in these institutions, Bill Clinton being a case in point. And even Donald Trump has some of his children educated at Georgetown University.
Okay.
So, yes, they're very heavily involved.
We have, now you're talking about that there is the right, that there's Jesus and there is Mary in Roman Catholicism. And in Conspiracies, which is the magazine that we are publishing, we have had a 3-part article about the conspiracies behind Christianity, and focused on the Roman Catholic Church and how it developed out of that. In this latest magazine, we have an article about Jesus not being a real historic figure, but being something that has been built out as, and you talked about that also on Greek mythology.
Yes.
And astrological symbols. So what is your view on Jesus? Is he a historical person, or is he built on old mythologies?
Well, there is no doubt that Jesus is a historical person. There's an abundance of archaeological evidence. There are many writers, ancient historians, who make reference to it. The Talmud makes reference to Jesus as a historic person with much animosity, as you can imagine. Josephus writes about the events around about the crucifixion and all of those events. And there have been archaeological finds of even the people associated with him, Pontius Pilate and all of these. And the records of the biblical events have been well collaborated by history. So I have no doubt that Jesus was a historic figure. The difference between the mythological messiahs of the past, you can go all the way back to Babylon, where you have the system of Nimrod, who was apparently reprimanded, cut apart, sent apart, then ascended to the sun, became part of the sun, impregnated his virgin Semiramis, and was born as Tammuz. So you have the mother, child, and the father figure. You have those in ancient Babylon. You take them through to Egypt. You find them in the Greek mythology. You find them in the Roman mythology. They just change their names. And there are many attributes which are similar. There's a victim. Vishnu, for example, is depicted with holes in his hands and holes in his feet. But then the Bible is pretty explicit as to who the Messiah would be, what the attributes of the Messiah would be, and also prophetically when he would be born, and what the circumstances around his life and death would be. If you take Daniel chapter 9, it gives you the exact year when the Messiah would be anointed. And those prophecies, by the way, don't work unless you apply the day-year principles, which the Reformers did. And there is great consternation in many circles about these prophecies because you cannot refute them.
And why can't you refute them? Because if you look back at how the Bible was put together, it was a Bible meeting in, I think it was it 391 in Nicaea,
Yes.
where they put these testaments together. So why? Can you tell me why should we trust these scriptures?
You see, the Roman Catholic Church claims that it gave us the Bible. Nothing could be further from the truth. They never gave us the Bible. The canon was established of the New Testament within the first 100 years after Christ, when there was no Catholic Church around. And the canon of the Old Testament was established 400 years before the New Testament era. So Catholicism, of course, adds other books, such as the apocryphal books. Now, if you look at the apocryphal books that were added to make the canon complete, as the Roman Catholics say, and you're anathematized according to the Council of Trent if you do not accept these books as genuinely part of the canon, well, then you come up with ridiculous notions like driving out demons with the gallbladder of a fish and worshipping objects. Jacob worshipped the top of his staff instead of, like the received text says, Jacob worshipped leaning on top of his staff. So there are so many ridiculous things, the worship of the dead, all of these issues, or the veneration of the dead, let's put it that way. You will find these in the apocryphal books, but these always come many centuries after the completion of the canon. So Rome never gave us a Bible in its canonical form. It corrupted the canonical form by giving us other versions, and in the 4th century they found the texts that came apparently from that era as more acceptable, like the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus, which was found in 1844. And these have additional books in them as well, like the Codex Sinaiticus has the Epistle of Barnabas in it. And the Epistle of Barnabas is pathetic, to say the least. And yet these manuscripts that contain such spurious documents are claimed to be, the best documents that there are. Most of the beginning of the Bible, most of the end of the Bible is completely missing. There is no book of Revelation in the Sinaiticus text, so how could you verify it and compare it to anything? The creation account isn't in there, so the beginning and the end of the Bible aren't present. Then the Epistle of Barnabas has the cross all walking by itself behind Jesus, and the cross talking and such, idiocy, such as things like those. It has animals changing, like the hyena and the weasel, giving birth through the mouth or changing their sex once they have given birth. I mean, it's such ridiculous rubbish, and yet these are considered the best documents. Now, if that's what Catholicism has added to the scriptures, then they should best have left it alone.
So you do not agree that Christianity was set up as a control system to control people and control their minds? You think that the Reformation is actually the word, genuine, and the Protestants have the right word of?
Well, I don't know how much of a study you've made of the Bible, but the Bible is actually an amazing book, written over millennia, and to find such harmony between books written over such a long period of time, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to this word, they have no light in them, says Isaiah 8 verse 20. And now I could still envision somebody putting books together. But to put a book together that has historical data that is being corroborated by archaeology, even in the face of great opposition and even ridicule, to come up trumps every time, mentioning certain cities which the critics would say didn't even exist, and then they find them, mentioning the names and the period of reign of certain kings that the critics say never existed, and then they find them archaeologically. Not only that, but the prophetic scenario, and provably written hundreds, many years in advance of the actual events, history written in advance to such an extent of accuracy, that must boggle the mind of many people. Then you have typology, where you have typological prophecy written into the stories of people's lives. I don't think the human mind is capable even of putting something like that together. It takes years and years of study to unravel it. I've read many books, and I've read many occult books and so-called channeled books, which are considered by humanity as, the ultimate in knowledge. And compared to the Bible, they are like garbage. There is no doubt that there is a divine aspect associated with the scriptures. And then the fact that you are prepared to give your life for the changes which it brings about. And not only your mental change, but your understanding, but also in terms of your moral change. That it can change a person from being morally questionable at the least and base at the worst to someone who strives towards a higher morality. That is something which is unique about the Bible. And then the fact that people were prepared to give their lives for what they had discovered. How many reformers died? How many people in the Reformation era were prepared to die rather than to give up what they had found? And if you go to the pre-Reformation era, the Waldensians, the Albigensians, the Hussites, weren't they all prepared to sacrifice their lives for this truth? And even today, you find people that are willing to sacrifice their lives for this great truth that they have found. Because it's not only what you find written in black and white, it's what it does to the heart that is important. And to me, who was an atheist, it is incredible that I could have been so ridiculously foolish as to believe that there is no God. So, yes, I believe what the Bible says, and by the grace of God, I would be willing to give up my life if it came to that. I'm not saying that I have the courage within myself, but by the grace of God, I would put my money on the Bible before I put it on any other book.
Thank you very much for that view, and it was great to hear you elaborate on how you look at the Bible and how you look at the secret societies, the Roman Catholic Church, and so on. Thank you very much, and have a nice day here in Denmark.
Thank you. Many blessings to you.
You're welcome. Thank you.